trickle in us. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this lunchtime event, and we're absolutely thrilled and delighted to be able to host, I think, what's a fascinating and incredibly relevant and pertinent discussion. The sort of focus is broadly around builders' sort of tax and aid dependence, but I don't want to give you the impression that we see it in such simplistic terms. And I think what we're going to find through the conversation is, I think, an interesting narrative around the role that aid can play in supporting improved tax effort within developing countries in order to begin to think about the exit from aid. And I think that's a very interesting narrative. And we're absolutely thrilled to have, to lead us in some of that discussion, Allen Kagina. Welcome to ODI. Is this your first time in ODI?
Yes.
I think it is. So we're doubly pleased to have you here. Allen is the Commissioner General of the Uganda Revenue Authority and has been so, I think, since about 2005. She's passing through on her way to the United States, and we were delighted to be able to offer her this opportunity to speak a little bit about this challenge of building up taxation capacity, administration and systems in order to start thinking through the exit strategy from aid. And I think no one better placed than Allen to help us with some of that thinking. Jonathan Glennie on my left, who is a research fellow here at ODI, formerly of Christian Aid, has been working with us in the last year very much on issues around aid dependence and exit strategies. And Jonathan's going to be a speaker as well. And then also my far left, Mick Moore, former colleague, now professorial fellow at IDS and CEO of the new International Centre for Tax and Development based down in Sussex. He's going to play a role as a discussant, but probably alongside others. He doesn't feel the need to have his own 10 minutes, but I'll see how we go, and I'll bring him in at some point. Welcome to all of you. Delighted to have you here. And I'll pass straight over to you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, Alison.
Do we need to put that on?
Yeah, let's do that. Okay. My name is Allen Kagina, and I'm really glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I have 18 slides. I'll probably speak to about 4 of them. A lot of it is background that you all know more than I do. Just a disclaimer. I am no tax expert at all. I'm not even an economist. My training is in public administration, but I've been in the tax area for the last 19 years, and I joined Ugandan Revenue Authority in 1992 as a customs officer. So basically my training has been in customs, training by experience in customs, until 2004 when I applied and got this job before I realized I'd jumped off the deep end. But from 2004 we began on a reform program. And let me just give you a little history about Uganda Revenue Authority. It was formed in 1992 out of, I think, 3 or 4 separate departments that were in the Ministry of Finance: the customs, sales tax, the income tax, and I can't remember the non-tax revenues. And they all performed independently in the Ministry of Finance, and they were extremely inefficient. And tax to GDP ratio was very low. It was only 6% at that time. And the efficiency of collection was really almost not there. Okay. So in 1992, government needed money. We needed to raise money to fund government programs. And so one of the reforms that were made at that time was to bring the departments together to take advantage of the recruitment policies that come with one department, the sourcing, and the automation that comes with the revenue authorities. So that happened in 1992. But there was no structural changes in tax administration. There was one reform. I think VAT was introduced in 1996. The Income Tax Act was reviewed in 1997. Basically, that was it. The rest was, automation here and re-engineering here. No serious reforms. And so we didn't actually see increase in the tax take. And corruption was a huge problem. Corruption was a huge problem in Uganda Revenue Authority because the tax laws give us, tax officers, a lot of power and so much discretion. And so accountability and transparency were not priorities. So we would lose a lot of staff, we were not collecting a lot of money, and we had the worst of reputations in the public. So in 2004, government decided, we need to do something about tax administration. So a diagnostic was done. And when the diagnostic was done by the IMF, the recommendation was we have to reform and restructure the revenue authorities. So a number of wide-ranging recommendations were made. It also happened to be the time that I applied for this job. The previous Commissioner General had finished her contract and the job was available. And so I applied for it. And when I got the job, the first thing the minister who appointed me said, okay, you asked for the job, here are the reforms, go do that. Go do that. And I thought, oh, God. Anyway, so we then, in 2004, with that big report from the IMF, I started looking for money to do these reforms. No experience whatsoever. A lot of zeal, but no experience. And government at that time told me we can't fund this program. It was about, I think it was about $19 million US, the program we had designed with my team. And government said, it's the middle of the year, there is no money, but you will just have to see how you can work within your budget to do the reforms. Of course, they couldn't use the budget that I had at that time. So, knocked on doors of development partners and got $15.3 million US. It's in one of the slides. And so we began these reforms. And so you will see in the slide that I will present what the benefit has been as a result of implementing that program. I just want to run through some slides very quickly. What is Africa's problem? Why should we have aid? Why are we so aid dependent? The trends of aid allocation in Africa, that is on the internet, anyone can just pick that up. The trends of domestic revenue mobilization, and then how aid has been used to boost revenue mobilization, and why Africa must be wind of aid. That introduction is not really important, but the African crisis. There were structural weaknesses at independence for a number of African administrations coming from a colonial era without very much training. Governments began to engage into programs without much planning. And very quickly, the cracks began to show in mobilizing revenue. As you know, until very recently, we've been exporting a lot of raw materials and importing very expensive finished products. The challenges that we encountered, a number of African countries that I enumerated there, have made us more dependent on aid rather than focusing on mobilizing our own resources to support the governments that are in Africa. Just a very quick graph. I wanted to show you the trends of aid allocation. In the blue bars are the total aid given to Africa from 1999 to 2009, and the red line with the boxes, the share of Africa to total aid that is given. I don't know if you can see that very clearly, but also I wanted to show you that how aid is spent. You can see that there is a lot of aid that goes into social infrastructure and services. And in the green one that I wanted you to see, especially the green line with the little triangles, the production sectors, the sectors that produce, get the least amount of aid or very little aid. So as a result, we're dependent because you're spending on the social sectors that are not productive, and the production sectors don't get as much aid as they should get. So naturally, you will not mobilize your own revenue. Perhaps another graph that is very interesting is the brown one, action relating to data. As you can see, it's quite erratic, but most of it, I mean, that crazy line is because it's also tied to some events that happened that needed, debt to be cancelled during those periods from 2006, you can see 2007, aid drastically reduced. Now, economic management of aid calls for coordinated strategy, and the two main areas are the fiscal sphere, which is influenced by recipient governments, and the monetary and exchange sphere under the central banks. The donors are using the project-based and the sector-wide approaches for delivering aid, but the focus really should be on those two areas. Now, having shown you really flying through those, let me just focus on the trends for domestic resource mobilization in Africa. We are beginning to see positive trends in Africa driven by resource-related tax revenues, where you see the countries generating that graph is those graphs are tax to GDP ratios, tax as a percentage of GDPs for selected number of countries. And where you see those that are performing quite well, it is basically related to natural resources. Except, Lesotho has diamonds, Uganda has a low ratio, and it's almost flat. In fact, from 2006, from about 2000, no, maybe 2001, it's been almost stagnant, 11%, 12. It went slightly, almost 12.9, and then went back down. So Uganda is not performing very well, and Uganda is the one, the blue line, it's actually the lowest there. But as you can see, they're almost all the same, except those that have natural resources. And the average for sub-Saharan Africa, I believe, is 18%. And Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi are all below 18%. It's only Kenya that is slightly above. And the Kenya story is actually interesting because the economies of East Africa are not very different from each other. But Kenya has continued to perform very well. And perhaps, and I really don't have facts on this, but if you recall, from 1992 to about 2002, development partners withdrew from Kenya because of politics. And when you match their tax to GDP ratio and their growth, you begin to see a lot of growth for Kenya in that period. Is there a story? Is there a story that Kenya began to tighten its belt and to go beyond surviving and building its economy? Is aid dependence a problem for African countries. So perhaps the availability of money makes countries there's less incentive to mobilize own resources. Because I mean, Kenya is, and has since then, from that time, has continued to perform better than all the countries in East Africa. Kenya has less, I believe Uganda has more FDI than Kenya, but Kenya has a higher tax to GDP ratio. So why is this FDI not producing revenue as much as it is doing in Kenya? The challenges faced by DRM in Africa, the informal sector in most African countries is very large. In Uganda, I believe it's about 43% of the economy is in the informal sector. And that's because in Uganda we currently don't have a citizenship identification, so it's very difficult to trace small businesses. The identification of premises, we do not have addresses. So if I was telling somebody, if I were to direct you to a company X, I would say, from here, 100 meters, take right, take left, tall building, there is a tree. After the tree is this business. I mean, it's that rudimentary. So it makes it very, very difficult for us to tax the informal sector. It's labor intensive. And I'd rather spend the money I have and the staff I have in auditing and inspecting the companies that are, because then it's easy money to get. Remember, in a lot of us in Africa, we work against targets, so you must deliver this amount of revenue. So the informal sector is a challenge. Skills, building skills of staff, slow adoption of ICT. A number of African countries, tax administrations are beginning to put in automated systems, but it's not catching up as fast as the larger companies, because the big multinationals have employ ICT. And so even the ability to audit the systems is still a challenge. A big one here, limited support from development partners, channeling the aid into tax administrations. That 2% that you see there is to the public sector in Africa. 2% of ODA is in the public sector. However, for tax administration alone, it's less than 0.1%. Less than 0.1%. Now, you can imagine what that means for countries like Burundi, for example. This is one of the new countries. If Burundi will take 10, 20 years before it begins to mobilize its own resources if money is not focused in tax administration. The low tax base, which is coupled with tax evasion and fraud, the handles, the space for taxation is small. Uganda is basically an agricultural country, but it's subsistence agriculture. Kenya, on the other hand, is also agricultural, but it is mechanized. It's commercial agriculture, and perhaps that's why we're seeing more direct taxes from Kenya than in Uganda. So the base is narrow. Misuse of transfer pricing techniques, coupled that with the lack of skills by the tax administration in transfer pricing information, and also the unwillingness of countries to share information where multinationals are planning to evade and avoid taxes. The other challenge is in taxation of extractive industries. Uganda discovered oil a few years ago, but building the skills, because the players in oil have been there hundreds of years. We discovered oil a few years ago, and so building the skills very quickly to catch up with the oil companies that have been in this business for a long time is a major challenge, and that's big money. That's big money. In fact, on the internet and in the international news, there have been stories about a tax dispute in Uganda, which I think is even coming to London for arbitration. So I'll be here again in a few weeks. And fingers crossed we're going to win this one. But the difficulty is very real. We have a low savings ratio relative to investment requirements. Just some information on the restructuring of tax administrations on the continent. To date, we have 15 African countries that have formed revenue authorities with support from IF and World Bank. Ours was formed in 1991. Yeah, and the total financial assistance that was given to the URA project up to 2000 was 8.6 million pounds. The 15.3 I told you was after that, because that came in 2005, I beg your pardon. Now, the relative low success of the efforts was attributed to the design and governance of the projects, because we'd had, in Revenue Authority, we'd had two reforms or reform programs before the 2004 program. And I honestly cannot put a finger to 2 or 3 areas that I said these are benefits that resulted directly from those programs. And I think the problem was in how the programs had been designed and how they had been governed. And then I'll tell you why I think this 2005 program succeeded. In 2005, the IMF carried out a diagnostic in Uganda Revenue Authority, and a modernization program was developed, focusing on key infrastructure for revenue administration. The program had a group of donors putting into a basket. So we had a basket funding arrangement by DFID, DANIDA, IMF, and JICA. Where we designed the program, what happened, I was telling a few colleagues earlier, was in 2005, when government directed us to reform the tax administration, we said, let's dream. What would we like the Uganda Revenue Authority to look like? Number one, what do the taxpayers actually want? What is it that they would like us to do? And so we approached it from both sides and designed a program that, in consultation with the taxpayers, that looked at re-engineering every single function of Uganda Revenue Authority. So we cut out a lot of old and archaic programs. Sorry, not programs, processes. And then planned automation for that. So we designed that into a program, costed it, was about $19 million US. We only got 15, and began to implement the new processes. We also did a human resource restructuring. We had huge corruption issues, many, many challenges. So we took a big risk and terminated everybody, all 2,000 staff. Terminated them and gave them opportunity to reapply for jobs into URA, but into a new organizational structure. So the jobs were fewer, they had been redesigned, the reporting levels were shorter, and every new job had been redefined. So we said, okay, you all had jobs in the old URA, you don't have jobs anymore, we'll pay a retirement package. There are opportunities here, you should apply. And at the end of 6 months, we had terminated about 500 people. Everyone went through interviews, and the criteria was competence and integrity. And as you know, integrity is very hard to, or corruption is very hard to to get to touch to know who's who. So we basically looked at anyone who had an incident, anyone who didn't do their work on time or was away from their desks for a length of period without explanation. Anything that would show that there's a problem in an area, we eliminated. I can tell you it shook, the entire institution. But the result was, from the lower levels, we got staff that were competent, that wanted to work, that, had been basically capped by a senior management that had been there for all that time and would not allow talent to go up. And I know that in 2005, when we did that exercise, we generated a surplus, a revenue surplus we had not seen in all the 14 years up to that point. So restructuring, human resource restructuring, is a key reform of any reforms that must be done in tax administration. Human resource restructuring, process restructuring, and then also we put in place a big tax education program, because we realized that the compliance in the business community was very low. The laws are very difficult for a common person to understand. I don't know how people understand the Income Tax Act. It's so difficult to understand. The processes in URA were not transparent. Nobody ever knew what they needed to do to pay their taxes. So we put in a tax education program, translated the processes, the procedures into local languages, went on TV and radio and in the business community, carried out tax clinics and seminars just to raise tax awareness. And we began to see revenue go up. So that graph, that diagram shows net URA collections that have grown at an average of 17% as compared to 15% in the period prior to reforms. And in fact, in the last, I think, 2-3 years, they've actually grown at about 20-23%. So the reforms do work. Aid works. That's what I'd like to say. And the tax revenue for government expenditure increased from 55.2 in the year 0405 to 67.9 in 2009-2010. And this is a direct result of reforms in tax administration, because in that period, there were no new revenue measures. There were no new tax policies. The VAT did not go up. And in fact, there were revenue reducing measures because there's been a lot of exemptions, to encourage investment in some sectors. So that growth is a direct result of that modernization program. I also thought I'd just show the main components of the reforms, the benefits to the taxpayer and the benefits to the country. The main areas we looked at was connectivity, both for voice and data. So all our stations, we have 62 sites. They're all networked, and that has made information flow very, very fast. That has helped enormously. Previously, we would employ a driver to carry documents from one office to another, and who knows what happens in between. But now we are all on one local area network. Oh, sorry, wide area network. We then also put in place online tax administration services for the direct and the indirect taxes, so that you can online register as a taxpayer, online file, online pay, and we can use the same system, we call it the e-tax, to audit firms, and that has drastically reduced the service time. We put in place an interface between the Ugandan customs system and the Kenyan customs system, the Tanzanian customs system, and the Rwanda customs systems. The Kenya has a system called SIMBA for clearance of customs, transactions. Uganda, Rwanda, Tanzania use Asikuda, an automated system for customs data. And what we did was then to put an interface that allows us to access information in the other countries. So we can see our goods coming to Uganda while they're still in the port of Mombasa. And this allows the business community to pre-clear their goods and to pay. So when they arrive at their border, if they're not selected for physical examination, they will just drive across. And this is for imports and exports. Drastically reduced border clearance from about 5 days to 3 hours over the period of, I think, 2005 to date. Tax education program that we put in place, I think I did speak to that. And then the balance scorecard, this tool that we use to help us keep focus on the taxpayers and on the staff and on the processes. And of course, we've had, because of integrity issues, a lot of tax administrations suffer from corruption. Using the money given to us by donors, we put in place an integrity enhancement plan. We implemented an integrity enhancement plan. And the components were very simple things like having a code of conduct and all of us signing to it, having a taxpayer charter so that everybody knows their rights and obligations, publishing the client service standards so that we know how long it will take to obtain a tax identification number. A lot of things that were done under that project. And also having a hotline for reporting incidences of corruption, whistleblowing facility as well. Then we put in a capacity building program for skilling our staff. And finally, that should actually be number one, because that comes before everything, re-engineered all the processes. That paragraph, sorry, that slide, something I just threw in to show that the reforms in Uganda are also taking place at the East African community level. But interesting to note that aid to the region, to the secretariat particularly, is growing from 40% in 2009 to 60% in this financial year. And a lot of this money is going to running the programs of the East African community. So the countries of East Africa need to quickly get together and agree to run this community themselves and be able to support the community programs. But also at the East African community, we're discussing the one-stop border, the modernization of transport infrastructure, which is a huge cost in doing business in Africa, and also the energy sector. The transport and energy sector and energy are the biggest costs in doing business in Africa, and particularly in East Africa. Hopefully that should be my last slide. Africa needs to be encouraged to mobilize its own resources. And using aid to support initiatives that generate own resources is the way to win Africa from borrowing. Otherwise, the dependency will never go away. If I can, I mean, it really is like a resource curse. If I can get money easily from you, why should I develop my own, my own, why should I mobilize my own taxes? So focusing aid in tax administration is the way to win Uganda of aid, so that Uganda can own its own development. And of course, the related areas is support to financial and goods markets, so that the business entities can borrow from and can save in financial markets. Prioritizing central government's expenditure. This is perhaps where we experience challenges. As tax administration, we mobilize resources, but expenditure is out of our control. It's out of my control. And sometimes expenditure is driven by the politics of the day or the disasters that happen on and off, like the droughts and the mudslides. Skills development is undertaken as a national priority, and the benefit is improved quality of labor in Africa, because we lose a lot of students that train and come and work in developed countries, because the space in Africa is very small, in Uganda especially. Then finally, to increase aid for trade, open trade corridors, have one-stop borders for purposes of information sharing, and this will address trade capacity constraints and promote trade and improve Africa's trade competitiveness. Let me stop there just with that slide.
Thank you very much indeed. That was, yes, well worthy of a round of applause. Thank you. And I think you set out there fantastically clearly both the journey of URA, which has been quite a remarkable one in recent times. But I think you also sort of smattered your presentation with this, perhaps some of the limits that even you organisationally run into in terms of the broader agenda of domestic revenue mobilisation, not least the sort of composition of the economy, a whole set of sort of regional and perhaps even global drivers, including the search for the ever more energetic search for natural resources and so forth. And I think maybe we can talk about some of those contextual issues as well in the discussion. But before we go on, I'm going to ask Jonathan to give us some, perhaps more partly in discussion role, but you're going to do a bit of scene setting too, I think.
Thank you. Thank you very much.